But I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights.
First of all, God didn't give those rights, men did. Regardless, by saying this in 2023, Charlie Kirk directly threatened the American people in favor of the gun industry. He, as an influencer to millions, called for the death of Americans at the altar of the gun. His audience, poisoned with ignorance and delusion, loved him for it. Charlie Kirk demanded the American people be sacrificed for the Second Amendment. He never intended for that sacrifice to be him. How can you be surprised that when someone calls for gun violence, they become the victim of gun violence? Outrage over the jeering of frustrated Democrats rings hollow and reeks of ignorance. The majority of those outraged don't even know that our friend Charles has been encouraging political violence and assassination for years. On October 31st, 2022, Charlie Kirk had this to say of the imprisonment of the terrorist who brutally attacked Paul Pelosi, who intended to kill Senator Nancy Pelosi.
And why is he still in jail? Why has he not been bailed out? By the way, if some amazing patriot out there in San Francisco or the Bay Area wants to really be a midterm hero, someone should go and bail this guy out. I bet his bail's like $30,000 or $40,000. Bail him out and then go ask him some questions.
Here, Charlie Kirk not only condones the would-be assassin's actions, but also calls for his release. Furthermore, this call is in order to influence an upcoming election. The only way Chucky could have been more clear is if he had said, "I'm Charlie Kirk. I approve of and encourage domestic terrorism and political violence." Assassination is highly inappropriate for a democratic society, even if Charlie encourages it. However, so is kidnapping and concentration camps. Here's what Chrissy K had to say about that on June 29th. You may think alligator Alcatraz is a bit much. You may think ICE raids at Home Depots are harsh. You may think sending gangbangers to a top security Salvadoran prison seems cruel. You may think mass deportations is a mean policy, but each leads to thousands and eventually millions of self-deportations. When illegals know there are real consequences for breaking into America, many, perhaps a majority, will conclude it's no longer worth the risk and return home. And that's exactly the point. In practice, ICE is rounding up undocumented immigrants and American citizens and throwing them in concentration camps without due process. The same due process that would be denied to the victims of gun violence that Chuck asked for, the same due process that Chuck didn't get. Next, I'd like to explore another Charlie quote that I've seen floating around, of empathy and sympathy.
I can't stand the word empathy, actually. I think empathy is a made-up New Age term that does a lot of damage, but it is very effective when it comes to politics. Sympathy I prefer more than empathy. That's a separate topic for a different time. Here's Cut 65.
This quote, and the throngs of tradwives emulating outrage over its misuse, is a classic case of conservatives feeling connotations rather than understanding language precisely. This mistake, initially committed by Choon Kirk, is repeated and further skewed in the social media telephone game. In order to understand anything, we must first take a measurement. To measure temperament, empathy is the very skill, the very process we use to make this assessment. Oxford Languages defines empathy as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Sympathy is the compulsion or choice to feel or do something about your understanding of another person. Oxford Languages defines sympathy as feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune, and understanding between people, common feeling. Empathy implies measurement. Sympathy implies an understanding. Charlie Kirk's understanding of either word was evidently substandard and toxic. I wonder what the sleepy-headed Americans would think of empathy and sympathy when they learned that Charlie Kirk bussed dozens of traitors to the Capitol on January 6th. Do they know that he turned over thousands of documents related to the January 6th investigation and chose to plead the fifth when questioned about his traitorous activity? To be plain, violence is not the way, but I have empathy, and thus no sympathy for stochastic terrorists like Charlie Kirk. Now, I've read a lot about Charlie Kirk in the last 24-ish hours, and many of these quotes I've read are so poignant, it pains me not to include them here. However, for the sake of time, I will share just one quote from a friend of mine. Kirk was a liar, snitch, and soft-handed Benedict who made a career off duping mooks. Sorry you got duped, Mook.